So today we're going to look at the U.S. entry into World War I. We're going to look at some specific reasons as to why the U.S. entered the war. And then we're going to look at why the war ended and what happened during the end of the war. So, to start off, the main question that we need to look at is why did the U.S. need to end their practice of isolationism? Which, to jog our memory here, isolationism is that practice of remaining out of the diplomatic relations of the war at that time. The first reason that we're going to look at as to why the U.S. ended isolationism is the attacks on vessels, on merchant ships in the open waters. Now, what ended up happening was the Germans created the U-boats. That was their term for submarines. So they sent these submarines under the water, and underneath the water they would shoot off torpedoes. And what ended up happening for a British ship that actually carried Americans was that a torpedo struck it and it went down, and it actually ended up causing a loss of 128 Americans. So needless to say, we the Americans were upset. However, the Germans thought, hey, we had a reason to do it because you were actually carrying machinery. You were carrying armed goods on there, so we reserve the right to shoot it down. We denied it. We said, no, it was just carrying passengers. That was it. Nothing else. However, time eventually told that upon investigation, there was actually 4 million bullets in the Lusitania. So it was carrying armed goods. The Germans were right in that sense. Now, were they right to necessarily shoot it down? No. However, they had their reason. So, the Lusitania sinks. The U.S. is upset, and tensions begin to rise against the Germans. Which brings us to reason number 2 on why the U.S. decided to end the act of isolationism. The Germans just kept attacking vessels and merchant ships left and right, sending torpedoes off, and they even did it to unarmed ships. The term for all of this was called unrestricted submarine warfare. So Woodrow Wilson, our president, decided to sever all diplomatic ties, all relations, any communication with the Germans if they did not stop this. Well, however, the Germans said, okay, yeah, well, I guess we'll stop that for a little bit. But, unfortunately, what ends up happening is this lovely guy, a highly ranked German official, he continued unrestricted submarine warfare. Which then brings us to reason number 3. Wilson decides to use his executive power as the president to arm all American vessels on the water. Because if we keep sending out vessels and they keep being torpedoed by the Germans, well, that's going to be a problem. We're under attack. So we end our neutrality and we end isolationism. Our final reason is the British intercepted a message from the Germans by this guy. His name is Arthur Zimmerman. He was planning a secret alliance with the Mexicans, and this message, eventually called the Zimmerman Telegram, said, hey, if you Mexicans join with an alliance with us, the Germans, then we will help you get land back from the Americans if you support us in the war. So there was now an obvious threat to the Americans, and we decided 1 month later to actually support the war. The president signs a war decree, we call in volunteers, and we're in war. Now, the war goes on for some time. We entered in 1917. It wasn't until 1918 that there was an actual end to the war. During that period, we ended up pushing the Germans back. There was a heavy loss and eventually an end because the countries could no longer support the war. So what ends up happening is something called an armistice. And for those of you who don't know what an armistice is, it's when basically you have soldiers and they say, hey, we're done fighting. We're not fighting anymore. They put down their arms and that's it. It showed that soldiers really do have a great input into peace negotiations, and the French were actually the first to do this. Eventually, we had the Belgians do it, the Russians, the British, the Germans, and then there's a formal ceasefire in 1918, and that's when it's almost an informal declaration saying, hey, we're done fighting, no more. And so that was an end to the war. Now, the formal end didn't come until Wilson drew up 14 points. These 14 points were the main reasons for calling of peace, and it called for a League of Nations, which was to ensure world peace and to prevent any more wars from happening. It called for countries to lessen their arms, specifically Germany. It called to break up huge territories in Europe. Remember when we looked at the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, Germany, they had large, expansive regions. Well, that allowed you to practice imperialism. And so breaking up those territories means an end to, hopefully, or at least to avoid, imperialism. And then it also wanted to call for a freedom at sea. So the four great men from the Americans, French, the British, and the Italians, they sit down and they make up this Treaty of Versailles. Let me say that again. Treaty of Versailles. If you need to repeat that, it's Versailles. Okay, so the Treaty of Versailles. They met in Paris. They drew up these plans. It was the official end to World War I. Again, it just emphasized the League of Nations to avoid wars. It changed territories to avoid imperialism. And it had the Germans accept full responsibility of the war, which was paying back $33 billion. And that actually didn't finally end until 2010. Yep. Alright, so post-war issues here. What ends up happening is you have Germans resenting, which means that they basically are upset for being told that they have the whole burden of the war on them, which plays some part into World War II. You have economies which are completely ruined. The British went bankrupt. The Germans went bankrupt. If you look online, you actually can see that the Germans ended up using money as fire fuel, stacks and stacks of it, because it was worthless. Kids were playing with money in the streets. People began borrowing money too in order to kind of get back into the routine of life. And what that ends up leading to is eventually the Great Depression, because when you borrow with money you don't have, something's going to happen eventually. Alright, so that once again covers the end of the war and U.S. entry into World War I. Now, the final question here for bonus for those of you who are listening. How does this relate, this cartoon, to the entry of the United States into World War I? So how does this relate to the entry of the United States into World War I? Bring that in on a sheet of paper and you will receive a bonus point. Alright, if you need help reviewing again, feel free to go back through this podcast. There's also more information on the Canvas site for you. And if you have any questions, just let me know.